In our last lesson, we dealt with the red horse rider out of the book of Revelation. This particular time, we want to deal with the black horse rider and what's significant about this one. Now, like the previous horse, more specifically, probably the red horse, we understood that horseman was a war horse. On top of that, he'll be controlled and manipulated by the Antichrist. It is literally the setting and the background, if you will, of what he will do and how he will gain control. So, of course, the question then becomes, if that is the case, what is the role of the black horse rider? Well, like the red horse rider, the black horse rider too, you can see that there's the birth pains that Jesus talks about in Luke 21. So, again, two things that we want to consider here. For one, obviously, both horsemen will be controlled in some shape or form by the Antichrist, who is represented as the white horse rider. And now let me just throw out too that this white horse rider, going back to that particular lesson, and I would suggest you guys to go back and look at both of those particular topics, dealing with the red horse rider and the white horse rider. But this particular white horse rider will not be Christ. This will be the Antichrist. And I just want to make sure I put that up, because in Revelation 19 or 20, it deals with Jesus coming back as the true white horse rider. And I know sometimes there's a confusion there, but it will definitely be a distinctive difference on that. And so we'll touch on that subject when we get to it. So also too, besides the Antichrist being able to obviously manipulate these horsemen, use it for his advantage, should I say, and at an appointed time, God's going to allow him to be able to do it. These horsemen will also be controlled spiritually. We believe that there's spiritual backings behind this. And why do I say that? Because typically behind every sin, every type of wrongdoing, anything that is opposed or against God, there's always going to be a spirit behind it. So, and it's usually a spirit of rebellion. In this case, sin, disobedience, rebellion against the things of God, against his goodness and his glories, what he set up. So those are two main points that we want to make sure we home in on. And of course, also too, as we discussed before, that these horsemen have been riding for a long time. Again, Jesus mentioned this not so much in horsemen, but in birth pains. This is kind of where we're at right now. The birth pains that we're experiencing, according to Luke chapter 21, deals with these areas of the horsemen. And if you look in the print very carefully, you can clearly see where we're at now. So when Jesus was talking about this, and now it's been a little over 2,000 years, we're still in that phase. But now things is getting ready to transition over to the time of the tribulation. And as we stated before, we believe that these horsemen will begin to go on their full gallop. They'll indefinitely be on the scene, and it just won't be just parts of the world this time, but this will be everywhere. Isn't it interesting that every time there seems to be a global situation, as we saw with perhaps Nimrod and others, there's always this power that comes up that wants to control the whole world, and God usually puts it down. He allows it for a minute, but then he shuts it down. And we've seen that with the Tower of Babel. So again, there's clearly nothing new under the sun. And as always, history teaches us a lesson. And when it teaches us a lesson, we would do well to heed what those lessons are telling us. So going to Luke chapter 21, it clearly tells us, verse 11, and there shall be great earthquakes in diverse places, famines and pestilence. Webster Dictionary tells us that famines is identified as an extreme scarcity of food, which results in starvation. Pestilence is also identified as an infectious or fatal disease that is widespread, or evil influence deliverer. So obviously, when we look at pestilence, it's spread out. And in this particular context, again, this is talking about birth pains, but it's identifying when these horsemen come, in this case, the black horse rider, what it will be carrying with it, the result of it. When we will look at Revelation chapter 6, verses 5 through 6, it tells us, when the Lamb broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, "Come." And I looked up and saw a black horse, and its rider holding a pair of scales in his hand. And a voice among the four living beings said, "A loaf of wheat, bread of 3 loaves of barley for a day," or, which is, of course, a denarius, when we're talking about money at that time. "And don't waste the olive oil and the wine." Now let's examine a few things here in this passage. He rides a black horse. Now when we're talking about a black horse, or in this case the color black, there's 2 things that come to mind. Black represents economy, and it represents famine. Number 2, he holds a pair of scales in his hands. The rider, the Antichrist, will be in full control of the world. The scales in his hands indicate a need for him to carefully measure out rationally a food supply. We notice because the next verse indicates the rider with the scales represents commerce and economy, basically money. And of course, with the economy system and all its problems we experience with this, such as corruption, poverty, debt, inflation, boom and bust, unemployment, financial loss. So here's a question for today. Do we see a sign of these type of things have happened, at least in the 20th century? And the answer is obviously yes. So if we take a little tour back in time in the 20th century, we see a few things. We saw the Great Depression in 1929 and how devastating that was. When we more recently see the Enron scandal in 2008, and of course the COVID-19 of 2020. So what do all these things have in common? I'll give you one name, the Federal Reserve. And why do I say that? Well, for one, the Federal Reserve obviously is not part of the judicial branch. It's not a legit organization, and it was founded on lies. Now, if you think about this for a minute, who does that remind you of? It reminds you of Satan in every aspect. And of course, the Federal Reserve is a very strong, powerful source. But there have been men and women that have tried to stop this organization, and they obviously have failed. Now, I can give you 2 to 3 dozen people that have tried and either have been eliminated permanently or attempts were made on their life or they were excommunicated some type of way. But I'll just give you 3 people. And one of those, there was an attempt on his life. But more modern times, so we can kind of keep things up to date and see where we're going. Let's look at the first individual, our 15th president, Abraham Lincoln. The truth is really told, and of course there's history work that has to be done, and I would encourage you guys to check this out yourself. What was the main reason for why he was assassinated? Now, a lot of people say, well, he freed the slaves. They teach you that in history schools, but they don't really go any further with that, and they probably can't. he actually had several problems in his particular day. He had the Jesuit order that he was contending with, and that was even before he became a president. He obviously had the slave issue situation, and that was an issue in itself. And that decision that he made was only after the death of his child and a few other things that happened to where that decision finally came through. And keep in mind, the North and the South were split up at that time, in terms of how they dealt with slavery and the freedom of the slaves and things of that nature. But the biggest issue that he ran across was the Federal Reserve. He basically wanted the American to have his own money, to have something sustainable, things of that nature, and to get rid of them because they understood that the bankers were controlling the money, which is why there was a big issue with the slave in the first place, because there was good finances that was made out of that. There was trade. Wars could be manipulated. If you think about that for a minute. The bankers were very powerful in what they did in terms of manipulating the war, see who would win, who would lose. Stocks get sold cheaper, somebody buys them, then the war ends, and now stocks go back up, things like that. It's not that much different from what we deal with today. For that reason, and perhaps, the others that I've mentioned, Abraham Lincoln had to go. He was a problem. Again, that's something that they won't teach you, obviously, in the schools anywhere. But the truth of the matter is, that's exactly what happened. That's the ultimate reason for why he had to go. He was a problem. See, for a country to truly be free, it's got to be able to have property. This is one of the mandates that God has set up even for the children of Israel. Property, land, things that you own. And of course, you see that eroding away to where now it's more of you won't own anything and you'll be happy. Okay, so we have that situation. Then we fast forward after him, we look at Andrew Jackson. Now, obviously, there's a lot of controversy behind Andrew Jackson. And obviously, this wasn't the type of guy, that, you have to watch with the corner of your eye on some of the stuff he did and said, and some of the problems that arose with him. But we don't want to discuss that right now. For the topic here at hand, we want to deal with the issue of what role did he play? Well, we know that there was an attempt on his life that was failed. Okay, so we know that for a fact. However, he, like Abraham Lincoln, faced two other situations. Again, he faced the Jesuit order. He didn't like the way they were controlling and trying to manipulate and trying to put in their system. Because everybody knows that when they actually got in the country, they took it over, and just a whole lot of bad history with that. So he didn't like secret organizations anyway. And then two, he had a problem with the Federal Reserve, which is one of the reasons why they tried to take him out also. So again, you see that comparison happening even with him. And then finally, we look at the third individual that unfortunately was taken out. That would be John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or John F. Kennedy. Now, there's a lot of stuff that he did, and there's a lot of things that he did good, but there was a lot of stuff that he didn't do so well. But again, on this particular subject, the big key thing is he had an issue with secret organizations, secret societies. Obviously, he was supposed to be the poster child to bring in the Catholicism movement to make it more powerful, in this case, the Jesuit order, and to have that strong within the system. But also, too, Federal Reserve, he had an issue with that. He had an issue with the secret societies involved in that. And of course, that and a few other things was one major reasons why he was eliminated. And I would say that of all the presidents, he was probably done the worst. I mean, it's reported that there was somewhere between 3 and 6 times that he was actually shot, and that the controversy behind it, that there was others that were involved and people that were eliminated and excommunicated. So there's just a whole history of just bad blood, and it followed his generation, his people, also with his brother and with one of their sons later on. So it was real bad history with that. So what's the point of all this? Well, Federal Reserve is key important. Why? Because we believe that when the Antichrist does come, he's going to control that system. He'll probably name it to something else, and he'll have full control. And that comes right out of the Black Horse Rider. Again, so we basically dealt with, the second part of that. I know that was a little lengthy, but I wanted to make sure we put it in context of what we're dealing with exactly. Because what you hear me talking about, and others that have done a deeper research on this ties into the Black Rider, that men will be controlled by, but ultimately that power will be given to the Antichrist to have full control. So we go now to the third situation of this. A loaf of wheat bread, or 3 loaves of barley for a day's pay. 3 loaves of barley equal approximately 1 pint. This is generally regarded as a minimum subsistence or diet. Therefore, this verse foreshadows a time when the entire day's wage will barely yield enough food to survive. And of course, another day's wages, in the time when John actually wrote this, was called a denarius, or a silver coin. That was literally enough that you could buy for that day if that's all that you got. Also, another thing to consider, most of the world today uses more of the resources of barley than wheat. And there's some difference with it. And there's things that you can do more probably with barley than you can with wheat. And I've kind of heard both sides of that. But barley, for the most part, is something that everybody in the world can use. It has a longer shelf life. And also, too, it also is even used for animal feed as well. So it's, if you think about it, it's kind of insulting that, food rationing will be high, people will be starving, and the food that they'll get for those that are poor will barely be able to get by with barley. Now, am I saying that this will be the type of food that all people can eat? No, I'm not saying that at all. It's possible, yes, in other countries it will be. But the idea of where we're at right now, that type of stuff can be generated and made. There's a lot of food that comes out of barley or grain or wheat and things of that nature, to where you can make a whole list of food and things of that nature. And two, another big thing about this stuff that we need to mention, in this particular generation, in this century, we have this thing called nanotechnology, to where it can replicate or duplicate not just machinery, but artificial and or food. So this particular device that we now have working and still practicing on can replicate food to expand quantities and things of that nature. So when you have organizations like, Monsanto's or something of that nature that can produce food on a massive scale, just imagine that being controlled by this one individual. And I'm just using him as an example. Now, the question then becomes, what is the most important thing people need to be able to survive? We obviously have shelter, we have food, our day-to-day, cell phones, things of that nature, technology. There's two major things in all that, but I'll just even cut it down to one. You can survive without technology. You can survive without shelter over your head. That men have done it throughout the years. There are different places to go, whatever the case, but you can survive. But the one thing you can't survive without is food and water. And even after all of that, if you don't have food, you don't have water, which our body is made of majority of water, you're not going to survive, you know. I mean, and food becomes even more important than medical, than technology, you know, than your cell phones, than your cars. The one thing that you have to have, you need substance. And Antichrist knows that. This world global system knows that. So wouldn't it be interesting that they're able to control all of this in one single time? So if that is the case, then what are we to do? Well, I mean, that's something just to think about. And with what's being talked about now these days, we're already headed down that road. We're seeing right now with the way the economy is, you know, the inflations and things of that nature. Again, all the stuff that I'm talking about simply is proving that the black horse rider is among us. Is among us in birth pains, but it's been here. It's not going anywhere. You know, I know that's a lot. It might be hard for some people to believe that are Bible readers and study the scripture. And I'm not trying to be contentious, but you can clearly see the times that we live in are clearly leading up to the end days, leading into the tribulation period. So it's important us to know what's going on now and talk about these things. You know, when we deal with, you know, the red horse rider and the black horse rider, you know, these two go hand in hand. You have war, you know, however that works out. And then you have black rider, which represents famine and the economy as a result of war. Both of these can be controlled and manipulated indefinitely, but one follows after another. So the position that the world's going to be in is going to be pretty serious, you know, to be in that particular place. And we're already, or should I say, we're almost there even right now. Now let's go on to number 4. Don't waste the olive oil and the wine. Olive oil and wine represents luxury items. Okay, keep that in mind. And they are, according to this, exclusive domains. In this case, the rich during the time of the tribulation, it seems from what it's saying that they'll be just fine. Now, when we're talking about the rich, we're talking about the super rich. We're talking about the billionaires, the controllers for the time being, how that works. Not just an ordinary rich person, somebody that has, you know, multi-million dollars, however that works out. They seem to be doing fine. And we see that now in countries that's, you know, has a lot of poverty, that a lot of their leaders are doing just fine. You know, they still live in luxury. So keep that in mind. When we talk about oil and the wine, these are fine objects. These are what, you know, the wealthy, they like. You know, things like your essential oils, which can be made out of different things, and expensive wines and things of that nature. We just put it into luxury. They'll still do just fine. Again, even with what we see today, you know, the most powerful and elites piggy bank and take advantage of the current crisis, especially of the COVID-19, you know, the Enron, the 1939, of the Great Depression, you know, took part of that and capitalized on it every time. I'm not saying all of them did, certainly not, but what I am saying, it makes for an opportunity to gain a profit, especially COVID-19. The rich, the super powerful, took advantage of that, of everything, and used it for their advantage. Now, that mindset, with that being said, is that of the enemy. Okay, so now that we dealt with these subjects, obviously we dealt with the famine and the pestilence, and, you know, the controlling of the food, and, you know, the scales, and the rich not really being affected. Now we can lead to 2 individuals in our 20th century that dealt with the whole famines and take control of the food and supplies. And just 2 individuals. And there's a lot that I can throw out there. But I want to point to these guys because they keep coming up. One of them is Stalin, and the other one is Mao Zedong. And check out from this video a little bit more about what they did.
Joseph Stalin went to war with his fellow citizens in 1929, when he launched an attack on Soviet farmers. He was determined to wipe them out as a class. This led to a catastrophic famine and the death of 5 to 8 million people. In a similar move, Mao Zedong declared a war of sorts on his own people, a violent attempt to advance China industrially on the backs of the populace. Between 1958 and 1960, Mao ordered the nation's agricultural sector to produce as much food as possible so that it could be exported to the Soviet Union in exchange for industrial help. False claims were made about the country's improving productive capacity, and critically needed foods were exported. By 1961, farm laborers were being forced into industrial production. But bad weather, poor harvests, and a diminished workforce brought about the death of almost 38 million from starvation and overwork. Mao refused to accept that his policies had caused the worst famine in Chinese, if not world history. Instead, he blamed those party officials who criticized his ideas. The Black Horse and its rider represent terrible famines that had destroyed millions of lives in one more chapter in the history of human tragedy. Let's emphasize that many of these deaths were caused by delusional leaders.
So as you can see, it's pretty impactful of what they did. And it's a shame. And the interesting thing about it, we'll see that happen again during the time of the tribulation. All one reason why I urge you, people, if you're watching this video, if you're somewhere in the distant future, or even right now, give yourself to Christ. Call on his name. I won't ever forget, one particular minister I always mention, for the altar call. As long as your blood is warm in your body, you still have an opportunity. As long as you have breath in your body, you still have an opportunity. We're all headed to the grave at different speeds. So make the choice. Choose Christ now. Repent and turn to him so you can avoid this mess. Because I'm going to tell you something. People don't realize how devastating this is. This is something that can't be described. And again, we're seeing this from this particular level now in the time that we're in. I can't imagine how greater it'll be later on into that particular time. And it's interesting because the death toll, besides what will happen with what the Antichrist can do, in terms of slaughtering Christians and the economy and then the wars and things of that nature, and then God's wrath and judgment on this world, by the plagues that he'll throw out to this world. There's going to be mass devastation and mass law on a scale that we can't even comprehend. So why even go through that? I pray that you take what I've talked about today in small detail, do your own history and your own research, but most importantly, examine these things carefully. We need to be like the Berean church that examine the scriptures. Don't take what I've said. You need to look this up for yourself. You need to study these things for yourself. I mean, a blind man, a deaf man can even see what's going on these days. These times, they can be scary if you don't know Christ. There's uncertainty, but you can be certain of one thing, that Christ, he has all the answers and he has already declared victory. I like how one minister said this, you know how we know we've won? Or perhaps I should say, to get yourself out of that mood of depression and sad and loss and it's like it's going to be all over, read the end of the book. It tells us that we win. Christ wins. He's already written history in advance. And if he's already done that, if we are in Christ, he's going to take care of us regardless. He has not appointed his wrath on his people. And he proved that time and time in Scripture. But he's showing the world what's to come. So we need to take heed of what he is saying in his word and what he has done, and take advantage of his grace, because that's what we need to be able to survive even now. But his grace is given to us that we don't even have to go through that stuff. Yeah, we're seeing tribulations, but again, as I've stated before, we're only seeing the tribulation that this world, men, and the enemy throw at us. As harsh as that can be, it's nothing compared to what the tribulation, because that's going to be the wrath of God poured out in full strength. A time like none other. Get yourself right with Christ. Turn to him while there's time. This is O.V. Moore with O.V. Ministries, Age of Grace, End of Age. I thank you guys for watching, and may the peace of God be with you and bless you. Shalom. I leave you with peace.
You can find OV Ministries on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, or on Vimeo. For immediate access to OV Ministries webpage, go to his Linktree website. We hope that you were blessed with today's message, and may you continue to keep the faith even as we go through trials in today's world. Remember, Jesus is coming soon, and may he find you ready for him.